Welcome to the New Rules for Work Labs, where we're rewriting the rules of work. In our lab, we glean insights from the world's foremost minds, exploring leadership, team dynamics, creativity, artificial intelligence, and warmth. Join us as we dissect, analyze, and incubate ideas shaping the future workplace. Stick around to learn how we turn these insights into practical activities. Get ready for a journey into the future of work. This is the New Rules for Work Labs.
Last year, we sat down with Laurel Farrer, an internationally recognized expert in remote and hybrid operations from Distribute Consulting. Our focus was the game-changing role of operational handbooks, specifically how companies can build a single source of truth for their ways of working. Now, if you're wondering what exactly these modern operational handbooks look like in practice, check out the companion article to this interview. There we break down the terminology and showcase real-world examples from companies that actively use these handbooks today. But in this conversation, we're going to zero in on what matters most to leaders right now: how to actually get started. If you're looking to modernize how your company operates and documents its work, this interview is your roadmap. Let's dive in.
All right. So, Laurel, we're here to talk about documentation and organizational performance. It sounds, well, what's got you excited about?
Really
Look,
exciting is the word that you're looking for.
Different strokes for different folks. But of course, this is important, and I imagine it needs to get revitalized. It's important to focus on, plays a critical role in the organization. My guess is most people don't even realize the role that it plays. What has got you excited about the role of documentation in today's organization?
I think that it just solves so many pain points that people can't figure out where they're coming from. And so they don't know what to do to fix it. And if we can just develop the singular skill of documentation, it will help knock down a whole lot of dominoes. So I think that's what we're here.
So there's the stupid debate about where we should work and whether we should be in the office or whatnot, which is overlooking how we work.
Yes.
And you have done great work on helping people understand how we work first. How is this modern take on documentation different from knowledge management and handbooks and all the stuff we've had forever?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you bring that up because, yes, as we advocate for remote work and workplace flexibility, and that is my area of specialty, is virtual organizational behavior. We very quickly get caught in this current of, well, are people more productive in the office or outside of an office? And that is completely the wrong conversation. What it needs to be, and what it was pre-pandemic before the hypergrowth of remote work, was that if we focus on how people are working and enabling their behaviors to be more location independent, then we can naturally, as an organic consequence, work in a variety of locations without interrupting business. So we're really focusing on autonomy first, and then workplace flexibility comes second. So that's what we want to do with all of this, is to focus on empowering and enabling individuals to be productive no matter where or when they're working. And that can be done through searchable knowledge.
I love that if you are very clear on how to get the result, you can do it anywhere.
Yeah.
But I've had companies who are legacy companies. They've been around for a very, very long time. They went remote during the pandemic, and it wasn't glorious. Because shocking, right? They went from all, we stand around in a circle and we learn each other and how to work that way to we're on Zoom or Teams or whatever. And now they're coming out and they want to go hybrid. And they're having internal schisms between knowledge working folks, the IT team, the design ops, who are like, well, GitLab does it, Atlassian does it, not recognizing that those companies have radically different foundations for doing that work than these other teams. So that's the scenario we want to play with. We want to talk about the companies who are kind of in that situation, who might come to you
Mhm.
where they've been remote and now they want to be awesome.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we first have to go back to history in March 2020 and just have a moment of empathy for all of us. This was not change management. These companies did not go remote. What they did is they implemented an emergency plan in order to maintain as much business continuity as possible with shelter in place conditions. So there was no virtual organizational infrastructure built. It was just, how do we change our workplaces and maintain our workflows as much as possible and as quickly as possible? So when they looked around a year later and they said, oh, everybody is working from different locations, I guess we are a virtual first organization now. That depended on what they had constructed prior to the pandemic, what kind of tools they were using, what kind of processes they were using, what kind of policies and they had in place. All of those need to change and be adjusted and optimized in order to truly become a virtual first organization. So if they had done those changes prior to 2020, then they probably were functioning in a more optimal state as a virtual first organization. But if they hadn't, then they were still operating on a contingency plan and calling it something that wasn't. So when we are facing as an organization, are we a remote first organization now? Are we hybrid? Are we going back to the office? That is all in reference to your workplace model. And again, this is not about where we're working. This is about how we're working. So how we're working in order to enable more flexibility of any level needs to change. We need to be much, much more focused on that infrastructure side and on that organizational behavior side that will then enable people to work very seamlessly as individuals in independent, autonomous roles, regardless of where they choose to work.
Okay, absolutely. So let's play with the fictitious company. I'm going to take the role of someone who has contacted you, right? You've got the expertise. You help companies work through getting their employee handbooks and their whole way of remote being into ship shape. So in this case, you've been approached by a mid-sized clothing and gear brand steeped in the culture of ranchers, rodeo enthusiasts, and the cowboy aficionados. So they want to get their employee handbook in shape. So the company itself is nearly 80 years old. But their operations, their foundational stuff was digitized 15 years ago. So they have online electronic records. And their IT and their design teams, they use Agile, they use design thinking. So they're modernized in many ways. But despite all of these advances, their employee handbook consists of a folder of HR policies that they hand out to new hires when they arrive, and that they update in announcements over email and the quarterly cowboy roundup meeting that they hold. and that's it. So question one from them, they've got the HR policies documented. What do they need to know about great modern employee handbooks before they get started?
That's a great question. And the comfort and the support and encouragement that I give to them in this moment is you've already started it. So this HR policy handbook that you were referring to is exactly the birth and origin story of modern handbooks. So what we want to do is just take that and iterate on that, because what we're looking to do as a goal and as a vision for handbooks, specifically in the world of documentation, is to create a single source of truth where anybody in the company, or maybe even outside of the company, can go to this knowledge repository and find what they're looking for. Maybe it's about a coworker, maybe it's about part of their role, maybe it's about, taking time off, whatever it is. They want to be able to go to one place and not have to figure out where to find something in the digital universe of this company. So that's what happened in the 80s and 90s. We saw this HR handbook that was sitting on the shelf and saying, well, we need somewhere that is about how this company works. And that's a star. That
Leather.
little, that leather
Oh.
bound binder that was sitting on every
You
HR
had
director's
a leather
shelf.
bound?
We all remember it.
It is a cowboy gear.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, all right, we pull off
It's
from under
That would be
branded
cool.
for this company, right?
Exactly.
So cool. We should make those.
Yeah, so we pulled that off our shelf in the 80s and 90s and said, all right, here's a beginning of how things operate at this company. Let's just add more information to it so that no matter what question you have about this company, whether it's HR or something else, you can find it in the same spot. And so we just took that information and kept expanding it and kept expanding it. And now it is that iconic single source of truth that so many distributed and remote first companies are using. So this company, I want to give them that encouragement of, look, you don't have to start from scratch and think, what in the world is a handbook and who are we going to have to own this and operate this? And where do we even start with content writing? You say, look, you've already got probably 30% of it done. So let's conduct a quick audit on the information that you do have versus the information that you ideally would want in a handbook. Figure out exactly where you are in that and figure out if there is more of that content that already exists in other places that we can just copy and paste right into it or hyperlink to it. And then the hard part's over. So it's really changing a mindset from this is a book that we have to write, which is a daunting project for anyone, to how do we create a navigation system to the information that already exists in your company? We want to create more of an information desk that you can go to of like, hey, I have a question about this project that the marketing team is working on. And this information desk is just like it has been for decades and decades and generations of somebody saying, oh, let me help you with that. What you're looking for is up on the 3rd floor, turn right, make a left. And that's the team that you would want to connect with about this project. And that's exactly what we're doing here is we're providing the information in the handbook, or we're hyperlinking to where you can find information about it. So if you're just thinking about a glorified table of contents, it's a lot easier to get the intrinsic motivation to start a handbook rather than thinking about we have to write a book.
All right. So you said something in there that I saw Dave's eyebrows go way up that we should touch on. As they're working on this, you mentioned, whether it's a single source of truth that's accessible to everybody in the team and maybe even the public. Why would they do that? Who in the public needs to know about how they make their boots?
That is another lane of the future of work is radical transparency, right? We do have a lot of sensitive and privileged information, especially as public corporations, but why, if it's not sensitive and if it's not, stock related, why are we keeping it close to the vest? So yes, there are definitely research and development projects that we need to, for the sake of intellectual property laws, keep them safe and protected. But if it's a question about how do we structure PTO days or, what's the average number of PTO that's offered to a new hire, do we need to keep that hidden? Is that secret, safe information? Or is knowledge sharing and documentation as a greater community just as beneficial to business as a whole as it could be internally in your organization? So the more that we share information and can share benchmarking data about how businesses operate, it really comes back to that root of all of this conversation, which is empowerment of autonomy, right? This empowers individuals to be able to negotiate for themselves and say, well, this company is offering this much money for my same role. Or I flagged that some DEI policy is supposed to be implemented in your hiring process, but it's not. Or we're really struggling with this certain product workflow. How has another company dealt with the exact same thing? And what have they learned from it? And maybe we could adopt it in our own company. It's just the same idea of let's share knowledge for the greater good.
No,
Why
because
not?
these companies tend to be competitive. I mean, it's nice when companies go out there and do it, but to you can infer a lot from, even if it's not necessarily proprietary information. I would think there's a benefit to the job hunter, right? If I can go out and I can compare and I can see what the policies are.
Absolutely.
Is who's a good example of, or maybe even of is there an industry as opposed to just a specific example of a company that has adopted these more public policies with relationship to their handbook?
Mhm. What pops into my mind immediately is how imperative it was in the
Mm,
earlier days of remote work. So, telecommuting has existed since
right.
the 1970s. So I'm not going back that far. I'm going back to when fully distributed workplace models, so 100% remote, started gaining a lot of traction and we're starting to scale up and starting to become an industry. And so when we as thought leaders were starting to share ideas back then, this is how we did it, is we just went into each other's handbooks and we said, "Oh, that's how you do compensation models with variety of tax infrastructures. And oh, that's how you negotiate nexus tax laws." And oh, like there was so much knowledge sharing that way, and we could test different theories and share with each other and say, "Oh, we tried that, but this worked better." And because of that, because we were all sharing in real time how we were incubating and prototyping all of these different infrastructure ideas, we were able to come together as a community and accelerate the development of how distributed companies could and should work at a much higher scale because we were willing to share that information. So none of the conversation was really about product. It was about business. It was about the future of work in general. And so the community really came together in about 2016. And because of that, we had best practices in place. We had glossaries in place in only 2, 3, 4 short years before it really hit the fan. And before in 2020 when everybody needed this information immediately. So we were still nurturing it at a small scale, but because we could share
Right.
this information so openly, it prepared the world to be able to
Yeah.
operate
It
that
seems
way
like
for
when
at
it's
least
new or
several months.
when it's novel, there is more of an incentive to share and get it right. And then maybe as it matures, people start to, oh, we're going to do it this way. And it's a little different. Maybe it starts to pull back. But I think a couple of things that have come to mind as you've been talking, because I think we're talking about more than an employee handbook. Like, at least what I think of the 3-ring
Mhm.
binder, whether it's something that was pulled off the shelf at Staples or it was leather bound with my initials branded into it, which would have been, really
Mhm.
nice. But, at all the big companies that I worked for, it was the former. And so, but when I think of documentation, I either go back to that employee handbook, which was like, when do I roll on benefits and how do I get my expenses reimbursed? And then
Mhm.
depending on what the job was, I had to document my code. But there was
Mhm.
a lot in between from a more of a process, like this is how we do things around here. Is what you're advocating for when, and maybe we shouldn't be using the word employee handbook, or has the definition changed? Is it more than HR and accounting policies?
Absolutely. 100%. So I tend to use the term operational handbook just because for me that encompasses the operations of the organization. So the goal of a handbook is to make any shared knowledge
Right.
searchable. And so that might mean, what is the marketing team working on? I'm going to start in the handbook because that's our single source of truth. And then I'm going to click through to whatever framework that handbook uses and say, I'm going to go to marketing and I'm going to figure out who's on the team. And then I'm going to figure out what projects they're working on. And that might mean I stay in that handbook. It might mean that I link to the project management system and it says, here's a list of the current projects that we're working on, and I click through and I navigate to the project management system. It might mean all of the HR things that you referred to. It might mean product development roadmaps. It might mean a directory to the people that you work with, because shared knowledge is not just technical knowledge, it's also behavioral knowledge. So you're also documenting any
Okay.
shared knowledge, such as how do we work here? How is our culture and our behaviors different here than it might be at a different organization? So you're going much, much, much more in depth into topics like values and behaviors, codes of conduct than you ever did in a physical organization. Because in a physical organization, you could observe those behaviors and you could, on your first day, be like, oh, we're like 5 minutes late kind of people. So if I'm like 5 minutes late, it's not a big deal because I arrived on time. People are still trickling in. Not a big deal. But in a virtual organization, if you show up 5 minutes late to your first meeting, that could go fine. It could not go fine. You don't know if it's not documented. So any type of knowledge about what does it mean to work in this organization is documented in an ideal circumstance. Yeah. So we're talking workflows, processes, behaviors, directories, compensation models, everything.
Well, and it's one of the things that makes for great marketing, honestly. Like, so a lot of the examples that we use in our blog posts about meeting behavior or way of working behavior come from companies who shared openly, like you're talking about, in the tech and the remote world, and then realized that having clarity about how they work and the fact that the way they work is cool made for good blog posts. So you can see things like Atlassian's, playbooks and all of these things coming out of that explosion.
Yeah. And it creates, again, that autonomy in all phases of the employee life cycle. As a job seeker, I can go to that culture and be like, whoa, self-select. That is not a good match for me. I don't like how they do that. I'm not going to apply. So then you're getting a higher quality and a higher match rate of candidates in your hiring process. In the middle phases of the employee life cycle, you're doing the same thing. People are able to align their behaviors more closely when they're saying, I'm seeing this happen in our team, but that doesn't seem like it aligns with our values per this page. So here's an example. Let's help keep each other accountable to what we believe our culture to be. And then same thing, that can also create defensibility and it can create empowerment in individual work as well. And saying, I think the example of neurodiversity is really, really strong. Having workflows documented has enabled so much more neurodiversity in our hiring processes because people are able to say, wait, what was that again? I just need a little bit more processing time. So write down the instructions and I can manage the process as in the way that I need to without the pressure of observation of people around me. It's world changing, but it is a big job.
It's all about how the employee manager, employer relationship can be improved with self-knowledge and clarity about how you work.
Right.
And our fictitious rodeo wear company is inspired by this. They're like, okay, we want to get to the place where we can share as much of our documentation publicly as possible. So they start down the road, they pick their platform for their single source of truth, they get those first pages up. And then, because it's on the internet, and even though it's private, who knows what happened, they decide to go through legal review before it goes live. And their internal lawyer goes through and he adds a bunch of red lines because that's what they do, and clarifying clauses.
Of course.
The documentation becomes a lot longer, maybe a little bit more obscure, quite a few footnotes to explain the terms. And then the lawyer goes on vacation and they're kind of stuck. So they realize, okay, that was the wrong path. That process won't work for us going forward, but they don't know what the right level of review is. So based on your experience, what's an ideal policy? And in terms of the review process, and what has to be true for that policy to work?
That's a great question. So I think always iteration is key. If you have the goal of we are going to write our handbook, that is literally a several-year project. So don't start with that in mind. Start with that as an objective or as a North Star, but start iteratively and say, how can we just make a better sense of what we currently have. We've gone through this digitization process a few years ago, right? Is that working for us now? Or is there any changes that we want to make before we take this to the next level? And then go slowly from there. So when we're talking about this specifically, working at the policies, that's going to start with that binder that's already on the shelf, right? We're just going to pull that down and be like, all right, is this still working for us? Before we use this as a foundation, is there any changes that we want to make with this? So that's going to be your first layer of this handbook, is just starting with the legal policies, not even thinking about handbook yet, but is this content ready to make accessible? So then after we do the policies and that legal side, then we start documenting processes. Those are the workflows. That's the operational content. After that's complete, and most of that should already exist in some format. Maybe it's a matter of formalizing it with a chart, but it should already be happening. We're just documenting what is currently existing in activity in the operations. And then after both of those phases are done, then we get into that micro level of the behaviors. So we're focusing on the people. How do we empower you? How do we enable you? How are we supporting your career development? What are our ways of working, et cetera? So moving from policies to processes to people is a clean way to break up this very daunting idea of how do we start thinking about this handbook. So specifically, if you're looking at just like a flexibility policy, there are those layers in that flexibility policy. The first layer is the policy layer, and that is, okay, legally, where can you work from in order to be in accordance with the nexus laws that our company has access to? Where do we have employer of records statutes in each country, right? So legally, where can you work from? Then the next layer is the processes. What does that look like? How will we get you equipment? Do you pay for that? Do we pay for that? What work schedule are you going to be required to participate in? What does, PTO look like? All of that. And then you go to the next level of, all right, are kids allowed to be interrupting meetings, or pets, or, do you have complete freedom in your schedule or not? And you can get into the more micros. So it's important to think about all three of those layers in any content development that you're doing.
So as the content gets developed, let's say they work through that for those policy things, and they find a way to do that in a reasonable time frame, right? The approval process gets manageable, and everybody gets super excited, and they want to write up how to run the quarterly meetings and how strategy works and whatnot. How do they decide who does that work?
Mm-hmm. So this is up to each culture individually. There are many companies that do put a single person in charge of the handbook. That is a very clean option. It's not a very scalable option. Usually that only works for company sizes up to, I'd say, 500 max. But there are other organizations that are much larger. You use GitLab as an example, where the theory literally is everyone contributes. And everyone does contribute. Any person, internal or external, can make a recommendation to a handbook page. And it can be a very small edit, like this word is spelled wrong, or I have a proposal for this entire policy to be different. And what that does is that each page has an owner who is responsible for that lane of decision making. And the request goes to the decision maker, the page owner, and then it is escalated or de-escalated as deemed necessary by that page owner. So the more that you can have everybody contributing, yes, it does feel very vulnerable for traditional leadership methods. However, that is the most scalable and sustainable option for shared knowledge management. Because the shared knowledge of your company
it's shared, right?
Like, you
Many
don't have
hands.
all of the knowledge. Everyone has all of the knowledge.
Well, and many hands make lots of typing go faster.
Yep. As somebody who has written hundreds of handbooks, I really like it when company leadership is confident enough in
Mhm.
themselves and they trust their workforces enough to actually delegate that work.
Oh, cool. So our cowboy friends
Yes.
have gone from having the binder with the brand on it and, with the policies, and now they're hiring people around the world.
Mhm.
It's 18 months later, right? They've got this handbook. It's full of things. It's not complete, right? But they've worked through a lot of problems. What do you see as as the consultant, as the expert who is brought in 18 months to 2 years later,
Mhm.
are the problems that they have not yet encountered and need to have on their radar?
Mhm.
And flip side, what are the opportunities they have not yet realized that
Mhm.
they're now ready to take advantage of?
Yes. Good question. Ideally, they will have answered these questions for themselves, because when we are establishing this mindset of documentation, it's also establishing that cultural norm of autonomy, right? So
Mhm.
ideally, what we want to see happen is that the workforce members that have been contributing to this documentation also feel empowered to be able to make changes and see problems for themselves and say, hey, this doesn't really seem to be working. Can we do this? And we want them to be proposing the changes and identifying those flags for themselves, because that is what will ensure that the handbook is not just a repository of content, but it's a cultural icon. It showcases how they work. So ideally, we wouldn't need to come in. However, if we do need to come in, I would be looking first for the sustainability of the maintenance. So was this a project that we came in a year and a half ago and just wrote all of this content and delivered, and people are searching it to find their answer and then logging out? Or has it been maintained? Do they have some type of ritual and cadence to say, how often are we going to update this? We'd love that to be happening weekly, if not daily, but at least quarterly or annually would be sufficient. And then we also want to be seeing activity levels, actually measuring the traffic in each of those pages to see, are people using this often? Because that's the goal. We want this to be a resource for them to answer any question that they have at any time of day about their work. So this is, their AI assistant essentially is like, I have a question and then I can find the answer quickly and easily by myself without having to wait for a meeting, without having to go into an office, or without having to interrupt the productivity of a coworker.
That's really clear. I mean, that's a really clear vision for these older companies with in-office experiences in terms of finding their way to this living online repository of talking about how they work with their teams and their public. Very cool.
Yeah. I just also want to point out specifically for our Western clothing wear and supplies, I think specifically for this company and any company that has manufacturing, one thing that I personally love is that it standardizes and equalizes the accessibility of knowledge between all levels of workers. So
Right.
if your manufacturing team in the warehouse, whether it be the distribution warehouse or the manufacturing plant, also has access to the handbook, they have access to every single piece of knowledge that their counterparts in the offices do. And that's a really empowering vision for the future of business, that everybody in your business can be on the same page, regardless not only of their location, but the location of their roles or the roles that they are performing in. So no matter what type of equipment they may be using, no matter what type of career path they're on, they all have access to the same information.
It's a really nice segue for any company in manufacturing, retail, hospitality that's been using something like Great Game of Business,
Mhm.
as a legacy system that they had printed out or they had on the whiteboard in their room, and they are already steeped in that kind of transparency across their distributed locations, but
Mhm.
haven't had yet a centralized perspective on it. swap out. It's really cool to write down the numbers when you're doing it in your weekly huddles. Like, here's where we are, and be transparent on that. You can do it on an iPad, right? It's like digitize the documents and create electronic ways. And then you unlock not just that deli, but that deli and the franchise deli 3 states over to have the same kind of thing. It's great.
Exactly. You go back like, oh, what did Elise say in that stand-up like 3 months ago? She said something really important and I forgot. So I'm just going to go find the agenda where we recorded that information. There it is. How does that compare to the same team that's doing the same thing over in London? Looks like our benchmarks are equal. Great. And I just answered all of those questions for myself without having to interrupt anybody else's productivity.
And they get to spread. Like, here's how we do. Lululemon does this wall where they talk about their vibes and their aspirations, right? Like, what's on the wall in Shreveport versus what's on the wall in Portland? Well, fascinating.
So this all sounds great, but we're dealing with a bunch of cowboys here. They like to do things their own way. So, of course, while these systems that we put in place, these searchable knowledge and navigation systems that we put in place are, of course, perfectly implemented, but usage varies depending on the individual, the department. But to play a little bit of a game and maybe explore how we might get more adoption or more equal usage across the company, I thought it would be fun for each of us to rank 5 standard departments in terms of adoption likelihood. Right. Especially at our company where we're dealing with cowboys, the Wild West, you've got to improvise. You've got to be out on your own. You're a bit of a Yahoo anyway. So some standard, let's see, I want to do this to everybody just to put into the chat. So standard organizations: engineering, product, sales, HR, accounting. So just so we have them all there. So
to be honest, it's not necessarily going to be the department or their roles that make them more or less likely to adopt these systems.
Of course.
It's going to be their managers and how their managers empower them to record and store information. So all of this is just like having a project management system, right? If an accounting assistant, or let's say a new hire in any of these departments goes to their manager and says, what is the latest status report on this blank, this client, this employee, this product, this, code review, whatever, right? What is the latest status report? And they say, the manager has 2 choices in that moment. They can say, oh, it's this. And I know that because I just looked at the documentation. Or they can say, have you checked the handbook? And so if they are developing and pointing those behaviors towards asking the shared knowledge database or the single source of truth, instead of asking individuals, that is going to drive behavior. It depends on leadership.
So what you just said is like an implementation detail, right, about how to make it successful at one level. But the other thing you just said was a redefinition of the role of the manager.
Yes.
Right. So in that world, with clear documentation, the micromanagement and the manager as the godhead that holds all the knowledge and you have to go through them goes away. So are you seeing faster adoption in companies that have sort of a servant leadership value base built into how they operate, or maybe a distributed autonomy kind of?
Absolutely. And this extends way beyond documentation, right? This is, again, coming back to that theme that we will say multiple times. This is about autonomy. This is about empowerment of people. So as managers, what that means is that we need to be trusted and trust in a new way, that we are no longer supervising our workers. We are supporting our workers. They are smart enough and capable enough and talented enough to manage their own work and to supervise their own work. We are there because we need to make sure that that aligns with everything else that's happening in the company. So we are not saying this is what you do. We are saying, how can I help you do what you do? What do you need me to support you on as you do what you do? So yes, it is mid-level management is 100% the area where we need to be investing in the most in order to transition more smoothly into the future of work. This has been a very, very punished, abused demographic over the past several years that we said, the world is on fire. And the leadership said, all right, everyone below me, make it work. And everyone at the entry level said, what do we do? And here's mid-level management saying, I don't know. And everybody's feeling threatened and confused and unsafe and unsecure because number one, we're in a global crisis, but number two, the business continuity fell on their shoulders with almost no instructions whatsoever. So here are our heroes that kept the businesses running with flying by the seat of their pants. And now we're asking them to continue this momentum into the next generation of hybrid or staying remote or going back to the office.
Or you guessed today.
Yeah, exactly. Again, with no instructions.
Right.
So we really need to focus on these people and helping them understand, what does it mean to be a manager in the future of work? You are safe. You are secure. This does not impact the security of your job, but it does change the description of your job. And this isn't just a pandemic thing. This is the fourth industrial revolution, right? This is big stuff. And we need to help them understand that they are the primary change agents in facilitating all of our businesses into the future. So we need to first have empathy for them, but then second, empower them and enable them with what it means to be a new type of leader that is not the leader that was based on literally the last industrial revolution, standing over the floor, watching the machinery, making sure that the factory was still operating at the right speed. We've been operating on that mindset for a long, long time. Now we have a different type of productivity, a type of work, and we need to adjust our management styles accordingly.
Right. So if you have that responsibility, ensure alignment, manage change, support continuity, then you've got a whole different way of conceiving of the job.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Keeping people connected and really redefining work and what it is to be a valuable employee and to contribute to a team and to be productive. It's an exciting era that we live in, and I hope that we all embrace the possibilities.
So middle management is hard. Everything old is new again.
For some,
So we've got all kinds of things in here. We've got all kinds of insights about how to get started, where to get started, why you might want to publish your documentation publicly, the importance of this living single source of truth that all kinds of people from all kinds of departments can reference in for different reasons on different days. Laurel, help us let people know how to find you when they are so excited about the possibility of taking this project on for themselves.
Absolutely. So I'm always easy to find at distributeconsulting.com or on LinkedIn. I'm the only Laurel Farrer. So if you have my name spelled right, you should be able to find me quite easily.
Fabulous. We will definitely make sure that that's available for people. Thanks, you
Laurel.
so much.
Thank you
for
having
spending
me.
time with us. And, I know we got gritty on these things, and I hope people appreciate that these are challenging, complex projects that have straightforward ways to get started, and that there's no reason not to get started right away.
Thank you for joining us in the lab. We appreciate our guests for contributing to the thoughtful discussions on the future of work. If you've enjoyed the ideas we've explored today and want to put them into action, check out our companion newsletter at labs.newrulesforwork.com for the practical activities and additional resources. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback is the catalyst for our ongoing journey into the future of work. Thank you once again for joining us. We'll see you next time in the lab.